This is my Marklin 5572 class 218 diesel locomotive from Germany. And I think the Marklin number is actually something different. I mean, I received it as second-hand, and it came in a box for the article number 5572. But I think this factory weathered version is actually a different model number. So I'm not actually sure, but I don't really have any information on that. And when I received it, it was installed with a smoke generator unit by the previous owner. But the loco itself also came with a factory Marklin sound decoder. So there was a sound decoder which obviously was not designed to handle a smoke unit. So there was a separate DCC decoder just to handle the smoke unit. So that was my main drive for me to convert this to ESU LokSound, and I've gone for the newest version, which is the XL version 5. So now that controls the sound, the lights, and well, everything in the locomotive, including the smoke generator. A couple of things that I've added, since this is probably an early 1990s vintage model. It had the small filament light bulbs for the headlights and the red tail lights. I replaced them with LEDs. I still kept the original LED pipe. I just actually replaced the light bulbs. So they are just a little bit brighter, not too much actually. The unit also came with cab lights. They were also small bulbs and they were really weak, so I replaced them with LEDs. And with the new decoder, the cab lights basically light up based on the direction, and they automatically goes off once the loco starts driving. And there were no lights installed in the engine bay, so I have done those as well. And the way Marklin installed the engine bay is that there is like a small silhouettes of like pieces of moldings behind each window separately. So I just installed really small LEDs in those windows. I couldn't remove these small moldings, so I couldn't fit the LEDs from the top, so they are actually from the bottom, which means that if I look at it from this upper viewing angle, I can see the LEDs, but that's the only thing I could do. And actually that's pretty much it. So if I shut down the lights, you can probably see the internal lights a little bit better. So I have cab lights as well, and if I change the direction, they also change direction. I have also the lights in the engine bay. Probably these are a little bit brighter and they are a different color temperature as the cab lights. I was using different LEDs, but actually I do like how they look. And of course I have the headlights and the red tail lights which change based on the direction. So that's quite standard. So let me go through the startup sequence and some runnings so you can hear how the engine runs. It has loads of different sounds that came with the factory, that came with the ESU sound project. There are a lot of station announcements. There are station announcements for different German trains, express trains, local trains. I kept most of them, so I think I'm going to use a few. And of course there are some other auxiliary sounds. You can also switch on the rear clank separately, so and that the frequency of that depends on the speed of the loco. And for example, wheel squeak, if it goes in tight radiuses, you can turn it on. There is additional wheel squeak when the engine comes to a stop. And also the compressor is something that I can switch on, but it also comes on automatically based on when the engine runs. So I'm going to test the sound now. So I'm going to get the engine up to speed and then probably turn on various sound effects like the rear clank or the flange squeal. I also want to show you the smoke generator in action. So this top panel is removable, and the previous owner made this steam pipe, or just piping. And this smoke unit is, if I'm not mistaken, it's called the Peter Clark model. Somebody was just selling a similar model, or actually the very same one, in one of the trader groups on Facebook. So this is how I knew about that. This is probably like a homemade, or, well, I'm not really sure. So this is definitely not the ESU smoke unit. So I just added some smoke. I'm not sure, the unit might be quite cold because I'm out in my garage now. And I just need to fiddle so that these pipes are lined up with the cutout here on the top. And here we go. The smoke unit only works if I have the sound on. So that was the smoke unit. This is how the loco looks like when the top is removed. It only takes a couple of screws and the coupler to remove, and in order to lift the top one off. And this is typical Marklin construction. So you have one single motor which is driving a couple of gears, which takes the power down to sort of somewhere here, where you have two crankshafts driving each of the bogies. So there is one single motor. This big base plate or something, it's a full metal cast, so it gives a nice weight to the engine. And what is also typical in the early Marklin construction, I think early, so this has a date code of 94, that it has this single PCB which basically just have some wires printed onto it, so that takes power, the lights and some of the other lines from one part of the engine to the other part of the engine. Because in the original setup, this is where I had the digital decoder which was driving the motor, so that was responsible for, you know, just the motor and the lights, and this was the decoder for sound, so that was a separate box. And the motor decoder had this connector which is just lying here, and the sound decoder had a very similar connector. I think it's a 10-pin connector, which is on the underside here. So what I have done is I've taken this PCB, I've put the connector on the underside of it, so it just plugs onto the factory connector, and then I mounted the ESU LokSound XL5 on top of it. I have some small wires which are running down, and in this PCB I have, in most cases I just have a couple of resistors for the LED lights, and then everything runs into these connectors, and I purchased these, I think this is called a JST connector, so it's 2-pin, you can only plug in one way, and that I'm using, I think, 5 of these here, just to take the accessories, so the lights, the cab lights, the engine bay lights, and also the smoke unit. So those are the 5 connections here. And the way I've replaced the lights is, again, in the factory setup, you have these connection here where you would just plug in an old incandescent light bulb, and I just replaced it, and the 5mm LED just slots into those connections here. And the only thing I had to do is where the lines or the wires come up from these LED connections here to this board, I just had to desolder those wires, and I just put a resistor for each of them, so they are not going to blow from the, 18 volt feed which comes off the decoder. And the reason I done this adapter plate, and also the reason I use this one, because if I want to, I can just uninstall all of these and I can just put the factory decoder back, so I can convert it back to this original form. I mean, I had to add a few extra wires and had to add the resistors, but I can remove those and then resolder the original wire back to the board. So I can technically put it back to the original state. Probably the only other sort of temporary modification I've done is in the top side. So these are the inserts behind the window that shows the, the engine and the internal components in the engine bay. And as I said, I wasn't sure if I could remove these without damaging them, so I just drilled some really small holes and I fitted some LEDs. So these got wired. Of course, the wire got glued onto the chassis so they don't flap around, because with this PCB here, it is actually quite difficult to fit the case back in if I have wires running on the side of the chassis. So I have the LEDs here, I also have LEDs here, and I also have 2 LEDs for the cab, which again glued to the top of the chassis. I might need to experiment with different glues here which still hold the LED, but they don't react with the plastic here. I can see a little bit of bubbling here, so obviously the type of glue that I used here is, it bonds very well with the plastic, that's for sure. And the type of LEDs I use, these, 2 type of SMD LEDs. All of them are warm white, and this is a SMD 5050 type, and I think this is the 3528. And if you drive them a little bit lower than the actual voltage, then the color temperature gets even more yellower, and this is what I'm doing. So for each of them I'm testing what is the best resistor to drive them from the 18 volts that the Marklin system gives out, and I go a little bit higher resistor, so I always drive them under, so the color temperature is something that I like, and also they are not extremely bright. The only thing I haven't modified here is these headlights, so they are just high intensity red and warm white 5mm LEDs, but still they are not really bright. So the light from these lights are fed into these light pipes, which take them to the the headlights and the various tail lights and everything. And it's not awfully bright, but even the standard Marklin setup wasn't too bright either. I think they just wanted to be more prototypical, so I'm fine with that. The only thing I couldn't do with this conversion is that in the original setup, because the front lights are here and the cab light was actually mounted here, so there was nothing in the chassis, so you can just lift the chassis, there were no wires going between. So obviously with these lights installed, and I replaced the cab lights up here so they are not visible from the outside, I have all these wires that are running from the decoder here to the top half of the case. So this is why I choose these removable ones. So if I want to, I can just easily unplug these. But I left enough wires so you can just place the top half next to it. I think what I would do next time is, instead of having these 2-pin connectors, maybe I'm going to buy some, 6 or 8-pin connectors. So I have one connector which connects all the wires from the top to the bottom, so it's much easier to disassemble them. But since I put it together, I didn't have to take it apart. I have easy access to the smoke unit because the top panel is removable. So I think it works quite okay. So that was my video on my conversion of this Marklin Class 218 to ESU LokSound XL5. Thanks for watching, and hopefully see you in the next video.